Section 1 of American Big Game Hunting, a collection of stories by the Boone and Crockett Club, edited by Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell, published 1901 by Forest and Stream Publishing Company, New York. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in October 2015. American Big Game Hunting, Section 1, The Boone and Crockett Club, by the editors. The aims of the Boone and Crockett Club are sufficiently set forth in Article 2 of its Constitution, which reads as follows. The objects of the club shall be 1. To promote manly sport with the rifle. 2. To promote travel and exploration in the wild and unknown or but partially known portions of the country. 3. To work for the preservation of the large game of this country, and, so far as possible, to further legislation for that purpose, and to assist in enforcing the existing laws. 4. To promote inquiry into and to record observations on the habits and natural history of the various wild animals. 5. To bring about among the members the interchange of opinions and ideas on hunting, travel, exploration, on the various kinds of hunting rifles, on the haunts of game animals, etc. The club is organized primarily to promote manly sport with the rifle among the large game of the wilderness, to encourage travel and exploration in little-known regions of our country, and to work for game and forest preservation by the state. Attention has been paid to all 3 points by the club, but especially to sport and protection. Nevertheless, exploration has not been neglected. In a trip after wilderness game, the hunter is perforce obliged to traverse and explore little-known regions, at least where he is in search of the rarer animals, or is desirous of reaching the best hunting grounds. And in addition to such exploration, which is merely incidental to the ordinary hunting trip, members of the club have done not a little original exploration for its own sake, including surveying and geographical and geological map-making. The results of these explorations, when sufficiently noteworthy, have appeared in periodicals devoted to such subjects or in government reports. The present volume is devoted to big game hunting and to questions of game preservation. In behalf of game protection, the club works through the state for the procuring and setting apart of reservations where forests and game alike should be protected at all seasons by the law. These great forest reservations thus become the nurseries and breeding grounds of game and of the large wild animals which are elsewhere inevitably exterminated by the march of settlement. Already several such reservations have been established in different states, both by national and by state action, for instance, the Adirondack Reserve in New York, the Colorado Canyon Reserve in Arizona, the Big Timber Reserves in Colorado and Washington, the island set apart in Alaska as an undisturbed breeding ground for salmon and seafowl, the Yosemite Valley and the Sequoia Parks in California. The most important reservation, however, is the Yellowstone Park, which is owned by the national government and is the last refuge of the buffalo in this country, besides being the chief home of the elk and of many other wild beasts. This is the most striking and typical of all these reserves, and has been thought well worth special description in the present volume, with reference to its effects upon the preservation of game. The enactment of laws prohibiting the killing of game anywhere, save at certain seasons and under certain conditions, must be left largely to the states themselves, and among the states there is the widest possible difference both as to the laws and as to the ways they are enforced. It is enforcement which needs most attention. Very many of the states have good game laws, but in very few are they rigidly enforced. Maine offers a striking instance of how well they work when properly framed and administered with honesty and efficiency. There are undoubtedly many more moose, caribou, and deer in Maine now than there were 25 years ago. and if the Maine legislation will see that the good work is continued, these noble beasts of the chase will continue to increase, to the delight not only of the hunter, but of every lover of nature and of the hardy life of the wilderness, and to the very great pecuniary profit of the people of the state. In other states, Colorado, for instance, good has come from the enactment and enforcement of game laws, but in no other state have the governmental authorities acted with the wisdom displayed by those of Maine, and in no other state have the results been so noteworthy. It is greatly to be wished that such states as Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, which enclose the best hunting grounds now existing in the United States, would follow Maine's lead. Another means by which the club hopes to bring about a proper spirit for the preservation of our big game is by frowning on and discouraging among sportsmen themselves all unsportsmanlike proceedings and all needless slaughter. The club has persistently discouraged anything tending to glorify the making of big bags of game, and it strives to discourage the killing of the females of any game species, save under rigid limitations. No harm comes to any species from the destruction of a moderate number of bulls, bucks, or rams, and these are the legitimate objects for the hunter's skill. Only legitimate methods of sport should be followed. Torch hunting and the slaughter of game in deep snow or in the water are held to be unsportsmanlike. Hunting big game in the wilderness is, above all things, a sport for a vigorous and masterful people. The rifle-bearing hunter, whether he goes on foot or on horseback, whether he voyages in a canoe or travels with a dog sled, must be sound of body and firm of mind, and must possess energy, resolution, manliness, self-reliance, and capacity for hardy self-help. In short, the big game hunter must possess qualities without which no race can do its life work well. And these are the very qualities which it is the purpose of this club, so far as may be, to develop and foster. End of section 1.
Section 2 of American Big Game Hunting, a collection of stories by the Boone and Crockett Club. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Marty at the Miami Airport Hilton. American Big Game Hunting, Section 2, A Buffalo Story by George S. Anderson. On the last day of September 1871, I joined my regiment, then in camp near Fort Hays, Kansas. At that time, the different troops of the regiment had not been assigned to their winter quarters. My own was on its way north from Texas, where it had been stationed since the close of the war. I was extremely anxious to learn what its destination was, for I had never killed any of the large game of the country, in fact, had never fired a rifle except at a target. Should my troop be ordered to Fort Riley or Fort Harker, east of Fort Hays, or to Fort Dodge, south of Hays, I feared that my chance of meeting with large game would be doubtful. To my great delight, however, I found my assignment was to Fort Lyon, situated on the northern bank of the Arkansas River in eastern Colorado. On October 12th, about 10 a.m., we broke camp and took up our line of march for the west, following the old Smoky Hill stage route. The autumn thus far had been very mild. The great migration of buffalo to their winter range in Texas had not yet begun, and I had some lingering doubts as to whether we might not reach our destination before the head of their column would cross our road. We had only gone about 10 miles from camp, however, when I espied a solitary old bull, and instantly I was all excitement, to the great amusement of my companions. Taking an orderly from the ranks, I put spurs to my horse, and was soon in hot pursuit of this decrepit outcast. This was sport new both to my horse and myself. We were both excited and equally timid. At a range of 50 yards or more, I emptied my revolver at the poor tottering old body, and a chance shot hit him and brought him to bay. It was now his turn to take up the chase. With some difficulty I recharged my weapon, and one or two more shots brought my first buffalo to earth. He was old and lean and mangy, and yet I was loath to allow 1 pound of his flesh to be wasted, and wanted to carry it all back to camp. The orderly said with a cynical smile, "Lieutenant, he ain't no good to eat, but you might want to take his tongue." His smile was changed to smothered laughter when he saw me attempting to carve up the corners of the animal's mouth in order to take the tongue out between the teeth. He dismounted, and with a single cut beneath the under jaw showed me how to take out the tongue properly. As evening came on, small groups of buffalo were seen dotting the plain. At sunrise we saw hundreds where the night before there had only been dozens. From this point on to Fort Wallace we were never out of sight of these nomads of the great American desert. From the higher points of our route, when the horizon was distant from 10 to 20 miles, hundreds of thousands were visible at the same instant. They were not bunched together as cattle are in droves, but were spread out with great regularity over the entire face of the land. On the third day of our march, a severe snowstorm set in, accompanied by a fierce north wind, a genuine norther. This night we were compelled to leave the road and go to the Smoky Hill River for water. We made our camp at the mouth of a small ravine that led down to the stream through the bluffs, which there form its banks. Millions of buffalo were driven before the storm, and being prevented by the high banks of the river from crossing either above or below this point, were huddled together in a dense mass which threatened to overwhelm our little command. By placing our camp a little to one side of this living tide, and under the friendly shelter of the bluff, we passed the night in security, while the countless horde kept up its ceaseless tramp. For 6 days we continued our way through this enormous herd, during the last 3 of which it was in constant motion across our path. I am safe in calling this a single herd, and it is impossible to approximate the millions that composed it. At times they pressed before us in such numbers as to delay the progress of our column, and often a belligerent bull would lower and shake his shaggy head as we passed him a few feet distant. Of course our fare was principally buffalo meat during this trip, and killing them soon ceased to be a sport. The next year, the winter of '72 and '73, this herd, during its southward migration, extended as far west as Fort Lyon, or some 70 miles further west than its route of previous years. It was probably driven to this course by the extension westward of settlements in Kansas and Nebraska. This was the last great migration of the southern herd of buffalo. Millions and millions were killed this season, and their hides and tongues shipped east over the Union Pacific, Kansas Pacific, and Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railroads. And this leads me to the short story I have to tell. The winter had been especially severe. The entire country north of the Arkansas Valley was deeply covered with snow, while the valley itself was comparatively open. The quarters in which I lived faced the south. The yard in the rear of my house was enclosed by a board fence about 7 feet high, and a wide gate afforded means for entrance. One night in the late winter, or early spring, the region was visited by one of those terrific storms for which this section is so justly celebrated. The wind blew with a violence such as I had never before experienced. The air was filled with drifting snow, and the temperature was in the neighborhood of 0. About the break of dawn I was awakened by my servant, who said to me, "Lieutenant, the wind blew your back gate open last night, and a buffalo has come in and taken refuge under the shelter of the fence." It was only necessary for me to raise myself in bed and look out of the window, which was at its foot, to verify this fact. I directed that my gun and a few cartridges should be brought me, and while my servant held up the window, I, still lying in bed, gave this solitary old bull a broadside at 50 yards range. At the salutation he started out through the gate, and before I could reload was out of sight behind the fence. So I rolled over to resume my morning's nap. 2 or 3 hours later word was brought to me that I had killed the buffalo, and that his body was lying about 200 yards back on the plain. I went out to him and took his tongue as my reward. Investigation showed that I had shot him through the lungs, and that he had been able to go thus far before succumbing to his mortal wound. Poor miserable old tramp! He had evidently been driven out of the herd to die, having become a useless member of its society, and in killing him I spared him a few days of further suffering, and scored a record of buffalo killing rarely or never paralleled. George S. Anderson. End of section 2. Recording by Marty at the Miami Airport Hilton.
Section 3 of American Big Game Hunting, a collection of stories by the Boone and Crockett Club. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Section 3 of American Big Game Hunting, The White Goat in His Country, by Owen Wister.
Part 1.
In a corner of what is occasionally termed our Empire of the Northwest, there lies a country of mountains and valleys, where until recently citizens have been few. At the present time, certain minds and uncertain hopes have gathered an eccentric population and evoked some sudden towns. The names which several of these bear are tolerably sumptuous. Golden, Oro, and Ruby, for instance, and in them dwell many colonels and judges, and people who own one suit of clothes and half a name, colored by adjuncts, such as Hurry Up Ed, and who sleep almost anywhere. These communities are brisk, sanguine, and nomadic, full of goodwill and crime, and in each of them you will be likely to find a weekly newspaper, and an editor who is busy writing things about the neighboring editors. The flume slants down the hill, bearing water to the concentrator. Buckets unexpectedly swing out from the steep pines into midair, sailing along their wire to the mill. Little new starring shanties appear daily. Somebody having trouble in a saloon upsets a lamp, and half the town goes to ashes, while the colonels and hurry-up eds carouse over the fireworks till morning. In a short while, there are more little shanties than ever, and the burnt district is forgotten. All this is going on not far from the Mountain Goat, but it is a forlorn distance from the railroad, and except for the stage line which the recent mining towns have necessitated, my route to the goat country might have been too prolonged and uncertain to attempt. I stepped down one evening from the stage, the last public conveyance I was to see, after a journey that certainly has one good side. It is completely odious, and the breed of sportsman that takes into camp every luxury, excepting, perhaps, cracked ice, will not be tempted to infest the region until civilization has smoothed its path. The path, to be sure, does not roughen until one has gone along it for 2,800 miles. You may leave New York in the afternoon, and arrive very early indeed on the 5th day at Spokane. Here the luxuries begin to lessen, and a mean once-a-day train trundles you away on a branch west of Spokane at 6 in the morning into a landscape that wastes into a galloping consumption. Before noon, the last sick tree, the ultimate starved blade of wheat, has perished from sight, and you come up to the end of all things, it would seem, a domain of wretchedness unspeakable. Not even a warm, brilliant sun can galvanize the corpse of the bare, ungainly earth. The railroad goes no further. It is not surprising, and the stage arranges to leave before the train arrives. Thus you spend sunset and sunrise in the moribund terminal town, the inhabitants of which frankly confess that they are not staying from choice. They were floated here by a boom wave which left them stranded. Kindly they were, and anxious to provide the stranger with what comforts existed. Geographically, I was in the Big Bend country, a bulk of land looped in by the Columbia River, and highly advertised by railroads for the benefit of those seeking homes. Fruit and grain no doubt grow somewhere in it. What I saw was a desert cracked in two by a chasm 65 miles long. It rained in the night, and at 7 next morning, bound for Port Columbia, we wallowed northward out of town, in the sweating canvas-colored stage through primeval mud. After some 18 miles, We drew out of the rain area, and from around the wheels there immediately rose and came among us some primeval dust, monstrous, shapeless, and blind. First your power of speech deserted you, then your eyesight went, and at length you became uncertain whether you were alive. Then hilarity of the sheer discomfort overtook me, and I was joined in it by a brother American, but two Jew drummers on the back seat could not understand, and seemed on the verge of tears. The landscape was entirely blotted out by the dust. Often you could not see the roadside, if the road had any side. We may have been passing homes and fruit trees, but I think not. I remember wondering if getting goat after all, but they proved well worth it. Toward evening we descended into a sullen valley of the Columbia, which rushes along, sunk below the level of the desert we had crossed. High, sterile hills flank its course, and with the sweeping, unfriendly speed of the stream, its bleak shores seemed a chilly place for homeseekers. Yet I blessed the change. A sight of running water once more, even in this overbearing flood, and of hills however dreary, was exhilaration after the degraded, stingy monotony of the Big Bend. The alkali trails in Wyoming do not seem paradises till you bring your memory of them there. Nor am I alone in my estimate of this impossible hole. There is a signpost sticking up in the middle of it that originally told the traveler that it was 35 miles to Central Ferry, but now the traveler has retorted, and 3 different handwritings on this signpost reveal to you that you have had predecessors in your thought, comrades who shared your sorrows. 45 miles to water, 75 miles to wood, and then the last word, 2½ miles to hell. Perhaps they were homeseekers. We halted for a moment at the town of Bridgeport, identified by one wooden store and an inchoate hotel. The rest may be seen upon blueprint maps, where you would suppose Bridgeport was a teeming metropolis. At Port Columbia, which we reached by a landslide sort of road that slanted the stage over and put the twin Jew drummers in mortal fear, we slept in one of the 2 buildings which indicate that town. It is another important center in blueprint, but invisible to the naked eye. In the morning, a rope ferry floated the new stage and us travelers across the river. The Okanagan flows south from lakes and waters above the British line and joins the Columbia here. We entered its valley at once, crossing it soon by another rope ferry and keeping northward. With the river to the east between us and the Colville Reservation, we had one good meal at noon, and entering the smaller valley, reached Ruby that evening. Here the stage left me to continue its journey to Conconnelly, 6 miles further on. With the friends who had come to meet me, I ascended out of Ruby the next day over the abrupt hill westward, and passing one night out in my blankets near a hospitable but limited cabin, its flowing hair host fed us, played us the fiddle, and would have had us slept inside. Arrived bag and baggage the 4th day from the railroad at the forks of the Methaw River, the next tributary of the Columbia below the Okanagan. Here was a smiling country, winning the heart at sight. An ample beauty was over everything nature had accomplished in this place. The pleasant trees and clear course of the stream, a fertile soil on the levels, the slopes of the foothills varied and gentle, unencumbered by woods, the purple cloak of forest above these on the mountains, and rising from the valley's head, a crown of white, clean frozen peaks. These are known to some as the Isabella Range, and Mount Gardner, though the maps do not name them. Moreover, I heard that now I was within 25 miles of goats, and definite ridges were pointed out as the promised land. Many things were said to me, first and last. I remember a ragged old trapper, lately come over the mountains from the Skagit River. Goats, did I say? On top there the goats had tangled your feet walking in the trail. He had shot 2 in camp for staring at him. Another accurate observer had seen 300 on a hill just above early winter as he was passing by. The cabined dwellers on the Methaw tied their horses to the fence and talked to me. So I had come from the east after goats, had I? And in the store of the man at the forks I became something of a curiosity. Day by day I sat on the kegs of nails, or lay along the counter devoted to his dry goods, and heard what passed. Citizens and denizens, for the Siwash and his squaws and horses were having his autumn hunt in the valley, knocked at the door to get their mail, or buy tobacco, or sell horns and fur, or stare for an hour and depart with a grunt. And the grave man at the forks stood behind one counter while I lay on the other, acquiring a miscellaneous knowledge. One old medical gentleman had slain all wild animals without weapons, and had been the personal friend of so many distinguished historical characters that we computed he was 19 about the time of Bunker Hill. They were hospitable with their information, and I followed my rule of believing everything that I hear. And they were also hospitable with whatever they possessed. The memory of those distant dwellers among the mountains, young and old, is a friendly one, like the others I carry, whether of Wind or Powder Rivers, or the Yellowstone, or wherever western trails have led me. Yet disappointment and failure were the first things. There was all the zeal you could wish. We had wedged painfully into a severe country, 12 miles in 2 days, and trail cutting between, when sickness turned us back, goatless. By this time October was almost gone, and the last 3 days of it went in patching up our disintegrated outfit. We needed other men and other horses, and while these were being sought, nothing was more usual than to hear, if we'd only been along with so-and-so, he saw goats here and there and apparently everywhere. We had, it would seem, ingenuously selected the only place where there were none, but somehow the services of so-and-so could not be procured. He had gone to town, or was busy getting his winter's meat, or his married daughter had just come to visit him, or he had married somebody else's daughter. I cannot remember the number of obstacles always lying between ourselves and so-and-so. At length we were once more in camp on a stream called the Twisp. In the morning, new stroke of misfortune, one of us was threatened with illness and returned to the Forks. We three, the guide, the cook, and myself, went on, finally leaving the narrow valley, and climbed 4 hours up a mountain at the rate of about a mile an hour. The question was, had winter come in the park above, for which we were heading? On top, we skirted a bare ridge from which everything fell precipitously away, and curving round along a steep hollow of the hill, we came to an edge and saw the snow lying plentifully among the pines, through which we must go down into the bottom of the park. But on the other side, where the sun came, there was little or none, and it was a most beautiful place. At the head of it was a little frozen lake fringed with tamarack, and a stream flowed down from this, through scattered birches and pines, with good pasture for the horses between. The park sank at its outlet into a tall, impassable canyon through which the stream joined the Twisp miles below. It was a little lap of land clear at the top of the mountains, the final peaks and ridges of which rose all around, walling it in completely. You must climb those to be able to see into it, and the only possible approach for pack horses was the pine tree slant down which we came. Of course there was no trail. We prospected before venturing, and T, the guide, shook his head. It was only a question of days, possibly of hours, when snow must shut the place off from the world until spring. But T appreciated the 3,000 miles I had come for goats, and if the worst came to the worst, said he, we could make it in to the Forks on foot, leading the horses and leaving behind all baggage that weighed anything. So we went down. Our animals slipped a little, the snow balling their feet, but nothing happened, and we reached the bottom and chose a camp in a clump of tamarack and pine. The little stream, passing through shadows here, ran under a lid of frozen snow, easily broken, and there was plenty of wood, and on the ground only such siftings of snow as could be swept clean for the tent. The saddles were piled handily under a tree, a good fireplace was dug, we had a comfortable supper, and nothing remained but that the goats should be where they ought to be, on the ridges above the park. I have slept more soundly. Doubt and hope kept my thoughts active. Yet even so, it was pleasant to wake in the quiet and hear the bell on our horse, duster occasionally tankers somewhere in the hill. My watch I had forgotten to place at T's disposal, so he was reduced to getting the time of day from the stars. He consulted the Great Bear, and seeing this constellation at an angle he judged to indicate 5 o'clock, he came back into the tent, and I heard him wake the cook, who crawled out of his blankets. "Why, it's plumb night," the cook whined. "Make the breakfast," said T. I opened my eyes and shut them immediately in despair at the darkness that I saw. Presently I heard the fire in the pans and knew that the inevitable had come. So I got my clothes on and looked at my watch. It was only 4:30 a.m. T and the Great Bear had made half an hour's miscalculation, and the face of the cook was so grievous that I secretly laughed myself entirely awake. Plum night lasted some time longer. I had leisure to eat 2 plates of oatmeal and maple syrup, some potato and onion soup, bacon, and coffee, and digest these before dawn showed. T and I left camp at 6:40 a.m. The day was a dark one. On the high peaks behind camp, great mounds of cloud moved and swung, and the sky was entirely overcast. We climbed one of the lower ridges, not a hard climb nor long, but very sliding, and often requiring hands and feet to work round a ledge. From the top we could see the open country lying comfortably below and out of reach of the howling wind that cut across the top of the mountain, straight from the Puget Sound, bringing all that it could carry of the damp of the Pacific. The ridges and summits that surrounded our park continually came into sight and disappeared again among the dense vapors which bore down upon them. We went cautiously along the narrow top of crumbling slate, where the pines were scarce and stunted, and had twisted themselves into corkscrews so they might grip the ground against the tearing force of storms. We came on a number of fresh goat tracks in the snow or the soft shale. These are the reverse of those of the mountain sheep, the V which the hooves make having its open end in the direction the animal is going. There seemed to be several, large and small. The perverted animals invariably chose the sharpest slant they could find to walk on, often with a decent level just beside it that we were glad enough to have. If there were a precipice and a sound flat top, they took the precipice, and crossed its face on juts that did not look as if your hat would hang on them. In this I think they are worse than the mountain sheep, if that's possible. Certainly they do not seem to come down into the high pastures and feed on the grass levels, as the sheep will. T and I hoped we should find a bunch, but that was not to be, in spite of the indications. As we continued, I saw a singular-looking stone lying on a little ledge some way down the mountain ahead. I decided it must be a stone, and was going to speak of it when the stone moved, and we crouched in the slanting gravel. T had been making up his mind it was a stone. The goat turned his head our way, but did not rise. He was 200 yards across a split in the mountain, and the wind blowing hard. T wanted me to shoot, but I did not dare to run such a chance. I have done a deal of missing at 200 yards, and much nearer too. So I climbed or crawled out of sight, keeping any stone or little bush between me and the goat, till I got myself where a buttress of rock hid me, and then I ran along the ridge and down and up the scooping it made by the split of the mountain, and so came cautiously to where I could peer over and see the goat lying turned away from me with his head commanding the valley. He was on a tiny shelf of snow. Beside him was one small pine, and below that the rock fell away steeply into the gorge. Ought I to have bellowed at him, and at least got him on his legs? I know it would have been more honorable. He looked white and huge and strange, and somehow I had a sense of personality about him more vivid than any since I watched my first silvertip lift a rotten log and sitting on his hind legs make a breakfast on beetles, picking them off the log with one paw. I fired, aiming behind the goat's head. He did not rise, but turned his head around. The white bead of my lineman's sight had not showed well against the white animal, and I thought I had missed him. Then I fired again, and he rolled very little, 6 inches, and lay quiet. He could not have been more than 50 yards away, and my first shot had cut through the back of his neck and buried itself in mortal places, and the second in his head merely made death instantaneous. Shooting him after he had become alarmed might have lost him over the edge. Even if a first shot had been fatal, it could not have been fatal soon enough. 2 struggles on that snow would have sent him sliding through space. As it was, we had a steep, unsafe scramble down through the snow to where he lay, stretched out on the little shelf by the tree. He was a fair-sized billy and very heavy. The little lifting and shoving we had to do, and skinning him was hard work. The horns were black, slender, slightly spreading, curved backward, pointed, and smooth. They measured 6 inches round the base, and the distance from one point to the other, measured down one horn, along the skull and up the other, was 21.5 inches. The hooves were also black and broad and large, wholly unlike a tame goat's. The hair was extraordinarily thick, long, and of a weather-beaten white, the eye large and deep brown. I had my invariable attack of remorse on looking closely at the poor harmless old gentleman, and wondered what achievement, after all, could be discerned in this sort of surprise and murder. We did not think of securing any of his plentiful fat, but with head and hide alone, climbed back up the ticklish slant, hung the trophies on a tree in a gap on the camp side of the ridge, and continued our hunt. It was not 10 o'clock yet, and we had taken 1 hour to skin the goat. We now hunted the higher ridges behind camp until 1 p.m., finding tracks that made it seem as if a number of goats must be somewhere nearby. But the fog came down and shut everything out of sight. Moreover, the wind on top blew so that we could not have seen had it been clear. We returned to camp and found it greatly improved. The cook had carpentered an important annex to the tent. By slanting pine logs against a ridge pole and nailing them, he had built a room, proof against wind and rain, and in it a table. One end was against the opening of the tent, the other at the fire. The arrangement was excellent, and timely also. The storm revived during the night, and it rained fitfully. The roar of the wind coming down from the mountain into our pack sounded like a Niagara, and its approach was tremendous. We had built up a barrier of pine brush, and this, with a clump of trees, sheltered us well enough. But there were wild moments when the gust struck us, and the tent shuddered and strained, until that particular breeze passed on with a diminishing roar down the canyon.
End of Section 3, Part 1. Section 4.
Of American Big Game Hunting, a collection of stories by the Boone and Crockett Club. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org.
Section 4.
Of American Big Game Hunting, The White Goat and His Country, by Owen Wister.
Part 2.
The next morning, the rain kept us from making an early start, and we did not leave camp until 8. Now and then a drizzle fell from the mist, and the banks of clouds were still driving across the higher peaks. But during the day the sun slowly got the better of them. Again we saw a solitary goat, this time far below down the ridge we had chosen. Like the sheep, these animals watch the valley. There is no use in attempting to hunt them from there. Their eyes are watchful and keen, and the chances are that if you are working up from below and see a goat on the hill, he will have been looking at you for some time. Once he is alarmed, 10 minutes will be enough for him to put a good many hours of climbing between himself and you. His favorite trick is to remain stock still, watching you till you pass out of his sight behind something, and then he makes off so energetically that when you see him next he will be on some totally new mountain. But his intelligence does not seem to grasp more than the danger from below. While he is steadfastly on the alert against this, it apparently does not occur to him that anything can come down upon him. Consequently, from above you may get very near before you're noticed. The chief difficulty is the noise of falling stones your descent is almost sure to make. The character of these mountainsides is such that even with the greatest care in stepping we sent a shower rattling down from time to time. We had a viciously bad climb. We went down through tilted funnels of crag, avoiding jumping off places by crossing sides of brittle slate and shale, hailing a dead tree as an oasis. And then we lost count. And T came unexpectedly on the goat, which was up and away, and was shot by T before I could get a sight of him. I had been behind some 20 yards, both of us supposing we had to go considerably further. T was highly disgusted. "To think of me managing such a botch as that," he said, "when you've come so far." And he wanted me to tell the people that I had shot the goat myself. He really cared more than I did. This goat was also a billy, and larger than the first. We sat skinning him where he had fallen at the edge of a grove of tamarack, and T conversed about the royal family of England. He remarked that he had always rather liked that chap Lorne. I explained to him that chap Lorne had made himself ridiculous forever at the Queen's Jubilee. Then, as T did not know, I told him how the Marquise had insisted on riding in the procession upon a horse, against which the Prince of Wales, aware of the tame extent of his horsemanship, had warned him. In the moment of the pageant, the Queen in her carriage, the crowned heads of Europe escorting her on horseback, and the whole world looking on, at this picturesque moment, Lorne fell off. I was not sure that T felt fully how inappropriate a time this was for a marquis to tumble from his steed. "I believe the Queen has sent somebody," I continued. "Where?" said T. "To him. She probably called the nearest king and said, 'Frederick, Lorne's off. Go and see if he's hurt. And if he ain't hurt, hurt him,'" said T, completing Her Majesty's thought. This second billy seemed to me twice the size of a domestic goat. He was certainly twice the weight. His hide alone weighed 30 pounds, as far as one could determine by balancing it against weights that we knew, such as a sack of flour or sugar. But I distrust the measurements of wild animals made by guesswork on a mountain top during the enthusiastic state of the hunter's mind which follows at once upon a lucky shot. Therefore, I can positively vouch for this only, that all the goats which I have seen struck me as being larger and heavier animals than the goats of civilization. After all, the comparison is one into which we are misled by the name. This is an antelope, and though, through certain details of his costume, he is able to masquerade as a goat, it must be remembered that he is of a species wholly distinct. We took the web tallow and the tallow of one kidney. The web was 3/4 of an inch thick. Neither elk nor any animal I have seen, except bear, has such quantities of fat, and I do not think even a bear has a thicker hide. On the rump it was as thick as the sole of my boot, and the masses of hair are impenetrable to anything but modern firearms. An arrow might easily stick harmless, and I am told the carnivorous animal who prey upon the deer in these mountains respectfully let the goat alone. Besides his defensive armor, he is an ugly customer in attack. He understands the use of his thin, smooth horns, and driving them securely into the belly of his enemy, jumps back and leaves him a useless, ripped-open sack. Male and female have horns of much the same size, and in taking a bite out of one of either sex, as T said, a mountain lion would get only a mouthful of hair. But modern firearms have come to be appreciated by the wild animals, and those which were once unquestionably dangerous to pioneers now retreat before the Winchester rifle. Only a bear with cubs to defend remains formidable. I said this to T, who told me a personal experience that tends to destroy even this last chance for the sportsman to be doughty. T came on a bear and cubs in the spring, and of course they made off, but his dog caught and held one little cub which cried out like a child, and its contemptible mamma hurried straight on and away. Not so a goat mamma, of which T also told me. Some prospectors came on a bunch of goats when the kids were young enough to be caught. One of the men captured a kid and was walking off with it, when the mother took notice and charged furiously down on him. He flew by in ignominious sight of the whole camp with the goat after him, till he was obliged to drop the kid, which was then escorted back to its relatives by its most competent parent. Yet no room for generalizing is here. We cannot conclude that the Ursus family fails to think blood as thick as other people do. These two incidents merely show that the race of bears is capable of producing unmaternal females, while, on the other hand, we may expect occasionally to find in a nanny goat a mother of the Gracchi. I wished to help carry the heavy hide of the second billy, but T inflicted this upon himself. "Every step to camp," he insisted, "for a punishment at disappointing you." The descent this day had been bad enough, taking 40 minutes for some 400 yards. But now we were 2 hours getting up, a large part of the way on hands and knees. I carried the 2 rifles and the glass, going in front to stamp some sort of trail in the sliding rocks, while T panted behind me, bearing the goat hide on his back. Our next hunt was from 7 till 4, up and down, in the presence of noble and lonely mountains. The straight peaks which marshal round the lake of Chelan were in our view nearby, beyond the valley of the Twisp, and the whole Cascade Range rose endlessly and seemed to fill the world. Except in Switzerland, I have never seen such an unbroken area of mountains. And all this beauty going begging, while each year our American citizens of the East, more ignorant of their own country and less identified with its soil than any race upon earth, herd across the sea to the table d'hôte they know by heart. But this is wandering a long way from goats, of which this day we saw none. A gale set in after sunset. This particular afternoon had been so mellow, the sun had shone so clear from a stable sky, that I had begun to believe the recent threats of winter were only threats, and that we had some open time before us still. Next morning we waked in midwinter, the flakes flying thick and furious over a park that was no longer a pasture, but a blind drift of snow. We lived in camp, perfectly comfortable. Down at the Forks, I had made a rough imitation of a Sibley stove. All that its forger had to go on was my unprofessional and inexpert description and a lame sketch in pencil, but he succeeded so well that the hollow iron cone and joints of pipe he fitted together turned out most efficient. The sight of the apparatus packed on a horse with the panniers was whimsical, and until he saw it work, I know that T despised it. After that, it commanded his respect. All this stormy day it roared and blazed, and sent a lusty heat throughout the tent. T cleaned the 2 goat heads, and talked Shakespeare and Thackeray to me. He quoted Henry IV, and regretted that Thackeray had not more developed the character of George Warrington. Warrington was the man in the book. When night came, the storm was gone. By 8 the next morning we had sighted another large solitary billy, but he had seen us down in the park from his ridge. He had come to the edge and was evidently watching the horses. If not quick-witted, the goat is certainly wary, and the next time we saw him he had taken himself away down the other side of the mountain, along a spine of rocks where approach was almost impossible. We watched his slow movements through the glass, and we were both reminded of a bear. He felt safe, and was stepping deliberately along, often stopping, often walking up some small point and surveying the scenery. He moved in an easy, rolling fashion, and turned his head importantly. Then he lay down in the sun, but saw us on our way to him and bounced off. We came to the place where he had jumped down sheer 20 feet at least. His hoof tracks were on the edge, and in the gravel below the heavy scatter he made in landing, and then hasty tracks round a corner of rock, and no more goat that day. I had become uneasy about the weather. It was all sunshine again, and though our first goat was irretrievably gone, we had the afternoon before us. Nevertheless, when I suggested we should spend it in taking the shoes off the horses, so they might be able to walk homeward without falling in the snow, T thought it was our best plan. We wanted to find a bunch of goats now, nannies and kids, as well as billies. It had been plain that these ridges here contained very few, and those all hermits, males who from age or temperament or disappointment in love had retired from society and were spending the remainder of their days in a quiet isolation in whatever is the goat equivalent for reading Horace. It was well enough to have begun with these philosophers, but I wanted new specimens. We were not too soon. A new storm had set in by next morning, and the unshod horses made their journey down the mountain, a most odious descent for man and beast in the sliding snow. But down on the Twisp it was yet only autumn with no snow at all. This was a Monday, the 7th of November, and we made haste to the Forks, where I stopped the night to read a large accumulated mail, and going on at once, overtook my outfit, which had preceded me on the day before. Our new camp, and our last one, was up the Methaw, 23 miles above the Forks, in a straight line. Here the valley split at right angles against a tall face of mountain, and each way the stream was reduced to a brook one could cross afoot. The new valley became steep and narrow almost at once, and so continued to the divide between Columbia water and tributaries of the Skagit. We lived comfortably in an old cabin built by prospectors. The rain filtered through the growing weeds and sand on the roof and dropped on my head in bed, but not much, and I was able to steer it off by a rubber blanket. And of course there was no glass in the windows, but to keep out wind and wet, we hung gunny sacks across those small holes, and the big stone fireplace was magnificent. By the next morning, T and I saw 300 goats on the mountain opposite where we had climbed. Just here I will risk a generalization. When a trapper tells you he has seen so many hundred head of game, he has not counted them, but he believes what he says. The goats T and I now looked at were a mile away in an airline, and they seemed numberless. The picture which the white, slightly moving dots made, like mites on a cheese, inclined one to a large estimate of them, since they covered the whole side of a hill. The more we looked, the more we found. Besides the main army, there were groups, caucuses, families sitting apart over some discourse too intimate for the general public, and beyond these, single animals could be discerned, moving, grazing, browsing, lying down. "Me God and be God," said T. He occasionally imitated a brogue for no hereditary reason. "There's 100,000 goats." "Let's count 'em," I suggested, and we took the glasses. There were 35. We found we had climbed the wrong hill, and the day was too short to repair this error. Our next excursion, however, was successful. The hill where the goats were was not 2 miles above camp. You could have seen the animals from camp but for the curve in the canyon. Yet we were 4 hours and a half climbing the ridge in order to put ourselves above them. It was a hard climb, entirely through snow after the first. On top, the snow came at times considerably above the knees. But the judicious T, I have never hunted with a more careful and thorough man, was right in the route he had chosen, and after we had descended again to the edge of the snow, we looked over a rock and saw 30 yards below us the nanny and kid for which we had been aiming. I should have said earlier that the gathering of yesterday had dispersed during the night, and now little bunches of 3 and 4 goats could be seen up and down the canyon. We were on the exact ground they had occupied, and their many tracks were plain. My first shot missed, 30 yards, and as Nanny and Kid went bounding by on the hill below, I knocked her over with a more careful bullet, and T shot the kid. The little thing was not dead when we came up, and at the sight of us it gave a poor little thin bleat that turns me remorseful whenever I think of it. We had all the justifications that any code exacts. We had no fresh meat, and among goats the kid alone is edible, and I justly desired specimens of the entire family. We carried the whole kid to camp, and later its flesh was excellent. The horns of the nanny, as has been said before, are but slightly different from those of the male. They are, perhaps, more slender, as is also the total makeup of the animal. In camp I said to T that I desired only one more of the 35 goats, a billy, and that if I secured him the next day, that should be the last. Fortune was for us. We surprised a bunch of several. They had seen me also, and I was obliged to be quick. This resulted in some shots missed, and in 2, perhaps 3 animals going over ledges with bullets in them, leaving safe behind the bully I wanted. His conduct is an interesting example of the goat's capacity to escape you and die uselessly out of your reach. I had seen him reel at my first shot, but he hurried around a corner and my attention was given to the others. As I went down, I heard a shot and came round the corner on T, who stood some 100 yards further along the ledge beside a goat. T had come down on him lying down. He had jumped up and ran apparently unhurt, and T had shot him just as he reached the end of the ledge. Beyond was a fall into inaccessible depths. Besides T's shot, we found 2 of mine, one clean through from the shoulder. The goat had faced me when I fired first, to the ham, where the lead was flat against the bone. This goat was the handsomest we had, smaller than the other males, but with horns of a better shape, and with hair and beard very rich and white. Curiously enough, his lower jaw between the 2 front teeth had been broken a long time ago, probably from some fall. Yet this accident did not seem to have interfered with his feeding, for he was in excellent plump condition. This completely satisfied me, and I willingly decided to molest no more goats. I set neither value nor respect on numerical slaughter. One cannot expect Englishmen to care whether American big game is exterminated or not. That Americans should not care is a disgrace. The pervading spirit of the far West as to game, as to timber, as to everything that a true American should feel it is his right to use and his duty to preserve for those coming after us is, what do I care, so long as it lasts my time? There remain a few observations to make, and then I have said the little that I know about goats. Their horns are not deciduous, so far at least as I could learn, and the books say this also. But I read a somewhat inaccurate account of the goat's habits in winter time. It was stated that at that season, like mountain sheep, he descends and comes into the valleys. This does not seem to be the case. He does not depend upon grass, if indeed he eats grass at all. His food seems to be chiefly the short, almost lichen-like moss that grows on the faces and at the base of the rocks, and between them in the crevices. The community of goats I watched was feeding afterward, when on the spot where they had been, I found there was no grass growing anywhere near, and signs pointed to its having been the moss and rock plants that they had been eating. None of the people in the Methaw County spoke of seeing goats come out of the mountains during winter. I have not sufficient data to make the assertion, but I am inclined to believe that the goat keeps consistently to the hills, whatever the season may be, and in this differs from the mountain sheep, as he differs in appearance, temperament, and in all characteristics, excepting the predilection for the inclined plane, and in this habitat he is more vertical than the sheep. Lest the region I hunted in may have remained vague to Eastern readers, it is as well to add that in an airline I was probably some 30 miles below the British border, and some 120 east of Puget Sound. End of section 4.
Section 5 of American Big Game Hunting, a collection of stories by the Boone and Crockett Club. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marty at the Miami Airport Hilton. American Big Game Hunting, Section 5, A Day with the Elk, by Winthrop Chandler. Early in September of 1890, we were in camp in the northern part of Colorado, an easy day's ride from the Wyoming line. Our party, 8 in all, consisted of myself, 3 friends, 3 packers, and a cook. We had been out nearly a month, and after the first week our success had been good. We were taking life very easily, hunting a little, fishing now and then, and doing a great deal of healthy, lying round camp. Game was plentiful. There were blacktail and elk all around us. The antelope, than whom the ammunition manufacturer has no truer friend, were within easy reach. One of the party had bagged 2 bears, and a packer had found a dead one, whose forepaws and ears were sufficiently preserved to be worth a $10 bounty to the finder. The outfit, with 2 exceptions, was content. Our cook, having surreptitiously drunk all the whiskey, was struggling with an increasing thirst provoked by an empty demijohn. My cup of happiness, unlike the cook's, had never been emptied, but it was far from full. I had not shot an elk. They were all around us, and had been for a fortnight. I had hunted them alone and in company. I had had many chances at young bulls